how do you market and manage and grow your business when the market is shrinking? The bottom has fallen out of demand. There's still some demand, but it's shrinking, it's not growing. And that creates a whole slew of problems for people who own office buildings.
Hi, I'm Rob Sadow, and you're listening to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where we interview the world's best thinkers, researchers, and operators on how to make flexible work work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Flex Index, the leading global insight platform for flexible work. Flex Index covers flexible work strategies from more than 13,000 companies across 100,000 office locations and 120 million people. Today, my guest is Francis Saele. Fran is a longtime real estate executive who is now the Managing Principal at MorteVita, a real estate and future of work consultancy. In this episode, Fran discusses the big shrink, specifically the pressures that office buildings are facing with the shift toward hybrid and distributed work. He forecasts the implications across geographies and for different classes of office space, as well as how AI will continue to impact the way we approach work. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us out by subscribing and giving us a rating. It helps us understand what episodes our listeners find most valuable and helps new listeners find the podcast.
This episode of Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Office Benchmarks. In today's hybrid world, workplace executives face critical lease and space allocation decisions. Make the wrong move and it could cost millions, impact productivity, and hurt retention. You need reliable data, not news headlines. That's why companies like TD Bank, Southwest, and Chime rely on Office Benchmarks. Office Benchmarks is the only solution that combines flexible work policy and office usage metrics to help workplace leaders compare their footprint, space design, and usage to peers with similar policies. Get started today at flexindex.com.
Fran, I am so excited for you to join us.
Rob, great to be here. And likewise, it's going to be a nice discussion, I hope.
Yeah, I think it certainly should be. So, Fran, you've got such a long and storied and interesting career in and around real estate, which is one of the reasons I was excited to chat with you. Tell me a little bit about how you got started in the first place.
Okay, you're not saying I'm old, are you?
Certainly not.
In trouble.
Certainly not.
Well, it's interesting. When I graduated from college, I was a psychology major, and my first job happened to be at the local bank. It's a pretty big bank where I grew up in Buffalo, New York. And I remember going into the program, which typically just rotates people around departments. And I went to the accounting department in a big sea of people with adding stuff, or they were doing things. And they said, you debit here and you credit here. And I asked the question, what's a debit? Or how do you feel about a debit? And about a month later, they said, but there's a guy who runs our real estate group and he really needs help. And we think you'd be a good fit there. So they concluded I really wasn't a banker, but that real estate might have some potential for me. So that's where I started. And it's been a long road since then.
That's so funny. I remember, so I went to business undergrad at University of Pennsylvania, and I remember doing accounting and learning these concepts for the first time and thinking very quickly to myself, I don't think I'm going to be an accountant. And so I think I probably share some experience around this topic. And so you've done a bunch of different stuff, anything from corporate real estate to development, et cetera. So tell me a little bit about the arc and some of the places that you've been and kind of how that's evolved over the course of your career.
Well, at the bank, it was by comparisons to some of the big banks today, much smaller, but it was an interesting period for the bank. They were in a growth period. They were building a lot of buildings. They built a building on a highway, and the only reason they built it was it had a time sign in the sky on the expressway, and it had a branch bank of about 5,000 feet. There was 80,000 feet of space. They didn't have any idea what to do with it. So they said, you do that. So that's how I learned. That's how I cut my teeth, I think, on in corporate real estate and leasing. That led to, after several years went by, I wound up recommending that we build a headquarters. And I somehow sold that to the bank. My competition was Jerry Hines, and he lost. But they probably would have been better off going with Hines, because when I brought the first budget review in, I got fired. But that I had the development bug. And so that led me into a couple of different regional development firms. These are spec developments of office buildings and industrial space in various parts of the country, mostly in the Midwest and in the Southeast down to Florida. I actually moved to Florida for a while and enjoyed that very much. But after a couple of cycles in the development business, one thing you find out is that you have equity in these properties and you're worth a lot on paper, but when the market crashes, that value evaporates. So I wanted to get into something a little different. And for my own little company that was aimed at doing lease auditing. And I don't know if you know anything about lease auditing.
Only a little bit.
But that, about 30% of what office tenants pay is actually not prescribed into lease. It's calculated by the landlord and billed. And most tenants don't challenge it, but there's an opportunity there to save a lot of money if you know what you're looking for. But that sort of morphed into a contract management role. And at the time, scanning of documents was very popular, and we were doing scanning, building databases, which were just kind of hitting the marketplace. We started to do a lot of work for CBRE, and at about 4 or 5 years later, they bought the company from me. So we grew. We had about 20 people before they bought us, and that led to running their what they call portfolio services business in North America. So it involved sales and operations and tenant management, a lot of interesting things. It was a good operation, and from that went to a similar operation, a little bigger in terms of regional scope, because I was a global leader for that same business for the Newmark Group in New York, which I'm sure you know. But when the pandemic hit, I concluded that business was not where I wanted to be professionally for the rest of my career. I wanted to do something that was interesting and new, and there's nothing better than the new world of work and distributed work to be in. So just went right from there into an Accenture. Recruited me over to them and stayed with them for a short time.
So what was it about the experience of the pandemic that caused you to have that career realization that maybe you wanted to be doing something different?
Well, if you recall at the time, this is, maybe March, April 2020, most business stopped. Everybody went home. There really was nothing going on. But some of the forecasts about what was going to happen were very dismal. Buildings were all empty, and yet the economy grew. And everybody said, well, why is that? And more people figured out that the same work that had been done in these big office buildings for 100 years could definitely be done in a remote environment. And of course, that continued for several months. And then there was some movement back towards the office as well. And we've had this yin yang for the next 3 or 4 years. Some of it's still going on, actually. But I think the conclusion is pretty much clear that we're going to remain in some type of distributed mode. Some people call it hybrid, where work really needs to be done in the right place at the right time by the right people. And that's now different for every organization, every business unit. It gets down to the individual. And the world of work has changed dramatically. Work itself has changed dramatically. And there's so many other new influences that are going to affect how and where work is done, especially AI. We can talk about that if we have a few minutes. But I think we're in the biggest change in this business that has ever occurred in history. And the world of work will be much different than it was for the previous 100 years, no question.
It's so interesting that you came to that conclusion, and the speed at which you came to that conclusion and the experience of the pandemic. I have to imagine that must have led to some really interesting conversations with colleagues, because different folks within the real estate ecosystem, and especially some of the larger firms, I think have picked up on this to varying degrees, to say the least, or may feel more or less embracing of that future. And so what was that experience like in 2020 when you started to have this realization? You must have had some very interesting conversations with colleagues at the time as you were starting to think about what the future looked like.
Well, yeah, especially if those colleagues were involved in the brokerage business or the transaction business. Transactions basically stopped. And there really weren't any building sales or purchases. There was very little leasing going on. So people were sort of sitting around saying, what do I do? And of course, that employment area has shrunk quite a bit in the last few years, and that's probably okay. I think the bigger question today is, what's going to happen to the legacy real estate that we're living with? I mean, buildings are good for 60 to 100 years, maybe. It depends on how you calculate that. Now, a lot of this stuff has been built in the last 10, 20 years. But what are we going to do with this property that doesn't really seem to fit very well? It's there, and a lot of occupiers have leases on them, so they're going to pay money to use these things. They try to figure out something to do with it. And that was a big part of the RTO situation. In addition to being able to supervise people that were working in front of you, because there was no mechanism really to do that with people working remotely. Now, of course, that's changing, and there's some things happening there that are extremely exciting that would allow this actually better views into work and how people are working than they could get today from just people sitting in front of them in an office. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
It does, and it's interesting. One of the things, Fran, that I appreciate about you, and you write a lot on LinkedIn and other places, and I enjoy some of the stuff that you share.
Thank
I
you.
think you have a gift for terming things and naming things sometimes, and so one of the things that you've talked about that we've discussed is the great office building retreat, if you will, which in some ways I think you're starting to refer to a bit. But talk a little bit more about that and what's happening, what you're seeing in the ecosystem at the moment.
Yeah, I think I've used the term the big shrink. Somebody played me something out of the Big Short the other day. This is the big shrink, and we have data now that supports this actually happening. And I'll just quote the stat. This is a CoStar stat that came out a few weeks ago. And as they looked at the renewals of all office space that is in their database, which is pretty much everybody, and they know when people renew, how long do they renew for, and what size is the space. The space that's been renewed in all of 2024 in across the United States, everywhere in the U.S. has shrunk 17%. Okay, so 17% of these tenants is a big chunk of space. If you extend that out to the entire built environment in the U.S., which is about 5.5 billion square feet, that's almost 1 billion square feet that people no longer seem to need. So what does that tell you? The other thing that we're seeing, I think, in new transactions, is that they tend to be much shorter than they used to be. Well, if you had a big space 10 years ago, it wouldn't be uncommon for you to lease new space for 10 years or 15 years, which allows for amortization of special improvements, things like that. Now we're seeing, maybe 7 years is the longest anyone will go. A lot of occupiers are demanding shorter terms because they just don't know what's going to be needed in 5 years, let alone, anything beyond that. So the two factors itself, and this is affecting, of course, the economics of the office building business. How do you market and manage and grow your business when the market is shrinking? The bottom has fallen out of demand. There's still some demand, but it's shrinking, it's not growing. And that creates a whole slew of problems for people who own office buildings.
Where do you think we're at in the cycle? Do you think we've hit the bottom of it? Is it still to come in the coming years? Like, what's your rough sense of it?
Yeah, my sense is we can't see the bottom because we don't know where it is. We know it's not zero, okay? But is it? We know the occupancy is about 50%. Okay, so despite the fact that there's much higher levels of leasing, occupancy is only about 50%, plus or minus. So that's still, of the 5.5 billion, that's still a very large inventory of space. But I would question, frankly, that space may not be in the right place. Recall in the legacy model for real estate, the user case was you wanted a big building where you could get everybody together in one place that's centrally located, so that you could come to the building from anywhere in the community. That led to CBDs, the central business district. That use case is not, it doesn't exist any longer. Very few, a handful of occupiers have everybody in the office 5 days a week. Okay, almost every occupier is much less, 2-3 days a week, and some much less than that. And then the employees have concerns about making the commute, particularly if it's a long commute, to go someplace where they wind up on Zoom calls. So my sense is that the actual need for office space will continue to be there. It'll be less than we had before in aggregate, but it probably will be distributed out to where employees are actually working and provide a good place for them to conveniently get to from where they live and where they work and play, whatever. And that's, if you recall, Adam Newman came out with something called flow, which is a kind of an esoteric concept. But the idea basically is that you're going to put some office space in places where people have apartments and condos and retail and other elements of their lives that's very convenient for them to get to. I think we're going to see that.
I mean, you can feel it already in some of the major cities. I think about, I live in, as we talked about, I live in Brooklyn. And so if you think about across New York City and the relative energy and busyness of different districts, if you will, feels incredibly different in Midtown than it does in Soho or other areas where people are more live work, if you will. In San Francisco, I think you see similar things where some of the areas that used to be quieter and more suburban within San Francisco itself are now actually incredibly busy all the time. But the downtown area or Soma, for example, can be super quiet. And so it seems like there's some even within Metro, kind of like reallocation or reorientation around energy and space, not just across metro or city center to suburb, for example, or across metros within the United States.
Right. And of course, every community is different for different reasons. But in general, I think the where office space is going to be in the future is going to be much more distributed than it had been in the past. And it's going to be serving a very different function from the now dead function of everybody together all the time. That doesn't exist.
And how does that look across quality, for lack of a better description, or tiers of office space? Do you think it's going to look, the future of this looks very different for Class A versus Class B space? Is there a really great stuff continues to have high demand and the middle does not? Is it kind of at the poles it's good and in the middle it's not good? Like what do you think is actually going to be the ultimate impact on the assets themselves?
Well, that's an excellent question. Again, that's very different depending on what you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about Manhattan, Manhattan's kind of a special place. It is America's cities. It is the headquarters of the Western world, basically. So we're going to continue to see, office development in Manhattan, and there are new towers going up right now. There are a handful of very attractive, new, very ecological buildings. They meet all of the new energy standards, all of the environmental requirements that are in place there, and exceed them. You have hospital quality air in some of these buildings. There's going to be demand there for those, major organizations that want to be headquartered in New York or have their executives in New York, or bring people in for, various activities. Those are continuing to be there. But if you were in New York and you had a C or a D building in downtown or somewhere in between one of the major hubs or major components, you'd probably be a little nervous about office use there. You'd be looking for something else that you could do there. And a lot of that has already occurred. Particularly in southern Manhattan or lower Manhattan, where a lot of former office space is now living space. And that sort of began, I think, back at the 2001 situation with, the towers going down. But so I think you're seeing these, even gateway cities like New York, changing. There will be a demand for the more significant, higher end buildings, certainly in gateway cities. In other cities, I don't know that that's the case. It may be, it may not be.
What happens to some of those property types or kind of like office types, if you will? There's been a lot of discussion around conversion and what percentage of the stock is actually convertible depending on the relative height of the building, light, ability to put in plumbing, et cetera. Do you see that as a viable piece of the picture for a lot of it? Or what do you think the answer is to addressing some of what may end up feeling a bit like a blight in terms of these zombie offices with low demand and
there are actually some zombie cities now. There's a part of St. Louis, which is a zombie city. It's not going anywhere. No one's going there. It's like out of a movie, and there are going to be more of those in some places. But my sense is that I'm trying to think of how to say this. The cities are going to transform, and they're going to transform. Some of these buildings are transformable into residential structures, for example. And there's some structural elements of some buildings that make that more adaptable and easier to do than others. But in any event, it's usually a complicated and expensive thing to do. And those are succeeding. There's been several in New York, by the way. They're succeeding where the local community makes an investment, if it's tax credits or some type of subordinated financing or incentives for developers to do it. You'll see more of it. I think that my sense of the read in that market is that of the entire inventory of office space available, it might be 10 to maybe 15%, maybe a little more than that. Could be converted on some economical basis with some incentive financing. If they don't have that, I don't see them doing much else than, you could use it for storage, you could use it for classrooms, you could use it there are some uses that are possible, but again, it's the buildings where they are. Does it fit the use case of the user, frankly, and are there better options for them with respect to travel, location, other factors?
It's an interesting predicament in my mind. I think about, let's go back to the example that you gave in St. Louis. When you have space like that, where it's unused and as a result, the area becomes run down, that's difficult for businesses and people who live in surrounding areas. It becomes difficult from a crime perspective. It can lead to kind of negative cycle for not just that particular area, but for even adjacent areas in a
Right.
way. What do you do to solve? Do you have a point of view on is there a policy change that's required, or is there some other besides just the conversion incentives for the 10 to 15% of stock that you can do that? Like I feel like a lot of people are racking their brains trying to figure out what do you do in some of those situations. I'm curious if you have a point of view around it.
Well, I think if you're already in a doom loop, if you're in that area in St. Louis, you're likely not going to invest any more money there. You're going to board it up, and you're going to wait for the government to come up with a plan to renovate that entire neighborhood, and likely that would involve taking down most of the existing structures, and maybe keeping a couple if they make sense, and then building up a totally different environment. Using
You just have to clear it. You're saying like basically like at some point you just have to clear it out and start over with it.
Right, right. And at some point, I think there will be some federal help there because it's such a monumental problem across the country. But it's too early for that to occur. But I'm sure that communities are going to want to get rid of these scabs on their cities, and eventually they will happen. But it's going to take a long time.
So let's flip to the maybe a happier side of this equation, which is okay for the space that is occupied and occupiers of space are thinking about in this new environment where maybe employees aren't in the office 5 days a week and they're thinking about maximizing the value and utility of the space. How are you seeing space evolve or be transformed to serve some of the new purpose or be fit to purpose relative to the way they're working now versus what it was like 5 years ago?
Well, I think this is a place where the flex business can really become a powerful factor associated with bringing the new world of work to an existing legacy building. I think we're seeing that. There's tend to be, I think, the industrious approach, for example, in terms of sharing of risk, sharing of reward. We're both in it for the same reasons. We do what we think we need to do for every tenant. It's much more a collaborative activity. And then I think we also see occupiers who want to have space, but they don't want to have it in the CBD. They want to have it in some distributed area. And there are flex operators in those areas who have, fairly good sized spaces, 5, maybe 10,000 square feet potentially, where they can dedicate a portion of the space to, in effect, a spoke operation of a group that has major facilities somewhere else. So, and they know how to transform it. I don't think most landlords know how to transform space from what they initially designed it for.
So are you envisioning almost a bifurcation of approach where you're a company, you need office space, you have below a certain square footage or number of employee need, you can rely on co-working or flex space as a way of basically being able to solve that. And then above that, it looks more traditional in nature from an occupier?
Yeah. So for the greatest flexibility and the lowest aggregate cost, particularly if it's a volatile team that's using the space, you stay with almost a totally flex or a co-working situation. But if there's a need, if there's a business group where most of the employees live in this suburb, and for whatever reason it's closer to a bar that everybody goes, I don't know, but and there's the ability to take down on a dedicated basis, not for 10 years, but maybe for 6 months or a year or 2 years, whatever. Those kinds of facilities, I think, will pop up within the existing inventory of space.
It's interesting because that lease term changes so much of the economics and the way you think about investing in space, right? Like there are certain investments in the way you would think about it for a 10-year lease that a 1 year or 2 year changes in terms of how much you can invest and customize the space. But in my opinion, so much of getting hybrid work right is having spaces that are fit to purpose relative to the type of work and what people are coming in to do in the first place. And so it's an interesting conundrum in some ways on how to get that right in short spaces.
It is. But I will say that I think most occupiers today will have difficulty with terms that go beyond 5 years. And despite the economics of a longer term from an aggregate perspective, if the users don't want to go there or the space is not marketable to anybody else, why should you stick your neck out? I think that's the question there. And we really don't have we think we have a good view, but I don't think we really do in terms of how work is evolving. Work is evolving so much differently than it ever had before. And I think when we get to the point where everything is digitized in terms of the business process, all the way through the production of the work and how people interact, it's all going to be basically in digital workflows and analytics. And those are going to be managed by AI. And the AI is going to say, hey, you're doing this here in this building. Why are you doing it? Then that's, they won't say that, but that'll be the question. Why are these people here when they could be doing it this way? And here's the cost, and it's all going to be spit out of some machine that is going to be, unhuman. Let's hope it's a human solution. But I think you're going to have many different solutions to where people should be working and why, as we become more asynchronized and more distributed.
What does that mean for the brokerage business overall? I mean, it's a business that you're super familiar with.
That's a really tough business to be in because those are almost all, commission-based people who historically have made a lot of money. I mean, I know brokers. I could always tell the brokers in New York by the size of the cufflinks and the types of shirts and how many colors are there. A lot of those guys have, left town, gone to Texas or something. But I think it is a tough time for brokers, particularly those who really didn't have to work all that hard to earn huge commissions. I think it's much more difficult today. And, I'm not saying that brokers don't work. I know a lot of brokers who really work very hard. But I think the income potential today is much smaller than it had been.
Do you think that leads to fewer brokers, consolidation of firms, that you end up kind of like refitting supply demand? Like, what do you think actually are the practical implications of some of those changes?
Yes, and yes. I think there's probably some mergers of corporate service firms. I mean, there've been several, but I suspect there may be one or two more left. It's just more economical to be bigger and to provide the work to a group of clients who fit that mold. Okay, which leaves a lot of smaller clients with nobody to service them, and that's an ongoing problem. But nobody really cares about those people because they're small. But there is a need for this type of service at a level below the Fortune, 1,000.
I imagine it also rewards being global in nature because the relative impact of this is different in different countries around the world. The U.S. being one of the most impacted, where there are parts of Asia where this is much less of a change, I think, relative to where it was 5 years ago in terms of operating model.
Right. Well, if you look at the global perspective, what you see is that Asia, for the most part, they went RTP, as I call it, return to the past. They went completely back to where they were. Essentially, not much change there. And there's probably less innovation going on there in not only in their space, but also in other parts of what they do. On the flip side, you see the U.S. at the other extreme, where it seems to be continuing this evolution of new, better, faster, more interesting, more productive ways to do things. Let's try it out. Okay, it's the mindset. It's the U.S. mindset anyway in terms of change, and particularly buoyed by technology and great innovation there, and particularly as AI. And I know I keep saying that, but that's really where it's at. And then you go to Europe, and it's very eclectic. It depends on the country and what part of the country and what the attitudes there are. And if you're in London, there's something special about London, like New York. But in other parts of the UK, it's all over the place, really. So there is no one solution, and there's no global solution. It's much more distributed and eclectic.
Yeah, and locally nuanced, it sounds like.
Yeah.
There's one other dimension of this I wanted to get your take on, because you think about this stuff in such a robust and kind of interesting way. The world we lived in 5 years ago, Fran, like if we were having this conversation in 2019, and you thought about what a floor plan looked like in most companies, you had some point of view on, square footage per square meters per desk. You have a head count, you've got a growth rate, you have to have a workstation for every person, right? Like it was a relatively straightforward thought process for the most part. Now there's a lot of discussion around, how do I make sure people come into the office, they're coming in for the right types of activities that make it value added to go into an office, right? Whether that be connection, onboarding, collaboration, mentorship, whatever it might be. Are you seeing in your clients or folks you talk to changes to the way that the space is set up physically in order to facilitate the types of activities that people want in the office when they go there? Or does it look and feel a lot the same as it did before, just people aren't there every day of the week anymore?
Well, I think to the extent that any occupier has made adjustments in their existing space, which, as we talked about, was designed for a completely different business use, Almost all of them have made some kind of corrections. I don't think they've just left all the desks in place and the limited number of conference rooms. So I think if you look at some people who are on LinkedIn and talk about this a lot, but I think we see a lot more collaborative space and a lot less dedicated workstations, basically for everyone. So I think that's certainly gone on. And if there is a specific use for a particular occupier, I'm sure the major designers can come up with really interesting and creative ways to make that work within an existing space. The question is it going to be enough to get people to come there more frequently than they might some other time? And does it really add any value in terms of the quality of the output? And that question is, pretty much up in the air. I think it depends. I mean, if you're a credit tenant and you've got a 15-year lease left on a building someplace, you probably want to experiment a little more with this and do something that will help to drive productivity and engagement and kumbaya. But if you could get out of it next month and maybe start up two other operations that might be a lot closer to where people live, you'd be more likely to do that, I think. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. One of the ways I've been starting to think about that is that there's a fundamental question emerging, which is what's the right way to think about measuring return on office broadly, right? Like if I were to think about the sum of investments that I make in space and getting people to go into the space and what activity happens in the space and what's the result then on productivity, engagement, and turnover, et cetera, versus if I didn't have the space at all. In some ways, that's the fundamental question that is raised, and it's a complicated one, right?
Well, it is. I think, but you kind of start out with the wrong question. For 100 years, the office was the heart of work. Okay, work and the office were sort of synonymous. Okay, beginning in 2020, that no longer exists. The cloud is at the heart of work, and the office plays a role, and the role depends on, is that the best place to do it, and where should that be, and how do you make that work for people on a collaborative basis, and should you remain? I think that's a great AI question that some large language model is going to deal with soon. I have seen recently some well, I guess they're algorithms which compare existing space to distributed space, and you can put in all kinds of variables and come up with a preferred or a much lower cost solution, and you can configure it any way you want. And but usually the locations or the models which have a large office component tend to be much more expensive over the term of whatever the period is, and they're a lot less flexible. So you can get flexibility within the existing legacy environment, but it's really not flexible. And it's definitely not located in the place where most people would want it to be.
I think it's interesting the way you raise that, because I think there's probably a bunch of executives out there still who think about the office as the center of gravity, not the cloud.
No, it just
and I think that's probably fundamentally the source of a lot of the debate,
right,
that continues on the topic.
Right. And I played this a couple times recently. It's come up. This almost the identical question has come up in 3 or 4 sessions I've been in recently, and I pointed to what I think is one of the best videos I've ever seen on YouTube. It's the journey that changed everything. It's a story about Bertha Benz, who was the wife of whatever the Benz person's first name was, who started Mercedes. And she's a very determined woman. It's a great story about her, and the video really captures it. And it shows how she, just on a lark, decided she was going to take their prototype and drive it 187 kilometers across Germany to visit her family. And she did it, and it broke down. It shows how it's fixed. And there's so many applications that you could apply to where we are today in knowledge work. You should really watch it. It's on YouTube. The Journey That Changed Everything, Bertha Benz.
I will have to check that out. So in that spirit, one thing I want to wrap up with is any prognostications, based on, you talked about a lot about how we got to where we are and some of the shifts that have happened. Look out 3 years, 5 years, any kind of major feelings or predictions on either where office will be or how we use space. I'm curious what's on your mind.
Okay. I've got my 8-ball here and my Ouija board. Which one would you prefer?
You can do both of them, either way.
That's a difficult question to answer for a lot of reasons. But my sense, based on everything that I have seen or am seeing currently, is that I believe we're going to have a much more intelligent workforce buoyed by AI, that individuals who are working in knowledge work are going to be enhanced. And it's interesting how this singularity is going to occur between their AI and themselves. So it's almost going to be one of these questions: is it yours, or did this machine make it? It's going to be the same. That's going to change a great deal, and I think we're going to see that kind of shift is going to really impact on most businesses. And you're going to see totally different conundrum than we're looking at today with employment markets and that sort of thing. I think the benefits of distributed work are certainly very clear to a lot of people. Outsourcing is still popular. The ability to work with people overseas is wonderful, and there's certainly great economies for businesses to continue to grow there. Although on the flip side, there's obviously a desire for Americans to bring more work back to America, where it's much more expensive. So you got to figure out a way to do both, I think, if you want to succeed in this world.
In some ways, it sounds like you think the employment dynamics and underlying productivity changes around employment might be the bigger driver here than the fundamental real estate.
Yeah, I think so.
Is that right?
Yeah. Question. There was a book written recently. I forget the author, but it's "The World is Flat." I think I'm not sure exactly how that came together, but I think now we're looking at a flat world, and you can go anywhere, you can do anything virtually that you could do wherever you are, and you have to open your mind to creativity with respect to getting work done. If you think about it long enough, you'll come up with a good solution. It's not the traditional solution by far. And so there are new and different ways of doing things. We just have to find them.
It's phenomenally put and a great way to wrap up. Fran, for anybody that really enjoyed hearing what you had to say, wants to learn more about you or things you're thinking about, where should I send them?
Okay, well, I think probably the best place is LinkedIn, because there's a lot of stuff on LinkedIn that I put out there, and my contact information is there. We do have a new website that's being developed right now, and that'll hopefully shake some people up. It's MorteVita.com. It's not available yet, but you can leave your name and you'll be one of the first to be invited. I just think that I'm happy to talk to anybody about any of these subjects at any time. It's fascinating to me, and I really enjoy the business.
Well, Fran, I really appreciate your time. One of the things I love about the way you approach this topic is that there's just not that many people who have spent as many years in real estate, both in small firms and in large firms, that have so quickly adapted to and thought about what are some of the changes that are happening, not just now, but in the future, and speak so eloquently about it. And so I appreciate you taking the time and sharing your thoughts. It is much appreciated.
Thanks, Rob. Great to be with you today, and I enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.